There we go. Okay, so this is my question. Can nature have rights, just like you and me? So thank you for that little introduction. So I'm studying climate change and environmental policy at the School of Earth and Environment. And I did a module on international relations and the environment, and it got me really interested in this question of rights for nature, which is kind of a bit of a weird concept if you think about it. But it's a cool way of it's a sort of oh, is that me? Don't think so. Anyway, sort of a cool way of curbing biodiversity loss. So in this talk, it's going to be in 3 sections. So first section, I'm going to talk about rights of nature and what that is. The second section, I'm going to be talking about international regimes and what they are. And the third section will bring the 2 previous sections together and ask the question, can rights of nature emulate these successful international regimes? So first of all, a little history of rights. So a right is a moral and legal principle for certain standards of human behaviour. And we usually think of rights as inherent or inalienable. They stem from your very existence as a human being. You don't have to prove anything or do anything. The fact that you exist means that you have human rights. And there's an interesting history of rights. Some argue the first rights document was the Magna Carta in the 13th century. There's also the English Bill of Rights, and probably most famously the American Constitution, which argued for inalienable rights. And John Locke in the 17th century was an Enlightenment philosopher from England, and he talked about life, the rights to life, liberty, and property. And finally, and perhaps most famously, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which talked about the universal jurisdiction. So it's quite interesting because it's a legal effort to actually limit the behaviour of states and their duties towards citizens, right? Which is quite interesting and quite unprecedented, because usually there's this idea of sovereignty, of states having sovereignty and they can do what they want within their borders, and then it's none of my business as long as they don't interfere with me. But this universal jurisdiction of human rights argues that maybe you can invade a country because they're breaching human rights towards their citizens, and we've seen this justification in many times, many wars. So what is rights of nature? So Peter Singer talked about an expanding moral circle to explain the sort of moral development of human beings. Rights of nature specifically views nature as a subject, not as an object or property. And in Western legal systems, we very often see nature as a resource to be exploited, as property. You own nature, you don't commune with it. But rights of nature argues that nature has a right to exist, persist, maintain and regenerate its vital cycles, and that therefore, because nature has rights, humans have a responsibility and a duty to enforce these rights on behalf of ecosystems, because ecosystems can't go to court themselves. They'll have to have human beings to go to court on their behalf. And this also has a very close link with Indigenous cultures and their traditional ways of life. Indigenous cultures, compared to Western cultures, see nature as a part of their society, an essential part of their life and livelihood and traditional ways of being. So there's quite an exciting opportunity for decolonization of legal systems and an integration of Indigenous non-Western morality. So Earth jurisprudence is the philosophy of law and human governance that argues that humans are part of a wider community of beings, and that the welfare of the whole Earth, the welfare of individual species and ecosystems, and the welfare of the whole Earth are all integrated. It's interesting, you could also argue that corporate personhood is a precedent for the personhood of ecosystems or non-human entities. So corporate personhood is a legal precedent that says that corporations, they're not natural human beings, but corporations can have some of the same rights as human beings. For example, the right to sue and the right to enter into contracts. which is quite interesting. So you could argue that because a corporation, which is not a human, can have rights, you could also argue that ecosystems that is not a human can also have rights. So that's really interesting. There are lots of academic journals and there are lots of current examples. So the first example here is Ecuador. They were one of the first countries to include in their constitution protections for Mother Earth. And New Zealand also has granted legal personhood to 2 ecosystems. I think it's the Te Urarewa Forest and the Wanganui River. And these ecosystems are very important spiritually to the Maori people. So that also implies a kind of decolonization of New Zealand's Western legal system. You also have the United States, which famously has the Lake Erie Bill of Rights for Lake Erie in, I think it's Ohio. Lake Erie was being polluted by corporations, and the local residents didn't have many means to sue those corporations, so they constructed this Lake Erie Bill of Rights, arguing that Lake Erie's right to flourish has been breached by this corporation, and I think they were pretty successful. And then finally, you actually have some examples closer to home. So in Frome in the UK, Frome Town Council tried to argue that the River Frome and the local meadows had legal personhood and should therefore be protected from degradation. I don't think they were successful, but it's still a pretty interesting example, and I was surprised that there was an example so close to home. So international regimes. So Krasner's definition is taken as the main definition of international regimes. So a regime is a set of explicit or implicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge on a given issue area. So you can talk about having a nuclear regime, right? Or a climate change regime. These are issue areas where there are sets of norms, principles, and decision-making procedures that govern what is acceptable to do, what is not acceptable to do. So I thought it was interesting to look at some existing international regimes, see how successful they've been, and then try and identify some common regime features, and then see whether rights of nature can emulate these features. So first of all, we have the human rights regime. So obviously a key institution is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also international courts as well. They're very important. They take a sort of supranational perspective and they implement this kind of universal jurisdiction, and they can have rulings that a lot of countries actually do respect, rulings on human rights. You also have domestic governance is a key reason why the human rights regime has been so successful. You have not only international courts and universal declarations, but you also have national courts. For example, the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission. You have national courts in lots of different countries. And this means that the universal claims in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can be translated on a national level, and that national rulings, as opposed to international rulings, are seen as more legitimate. They hold more sort of teeth. People are more likely to take them seriously. The powerful rhetoric of human rights has also been very helpful. It's a very powerful political language. If someone claims they have a right to something, that's a very strong claim, and it evokes a kind of emotive. It evokes emotive language, right? Which is probably been why the human rights regime has been very powerful. And also, interestingly, you could argue that there was a triggering event that caused the human rights regime to really take off in a big way. The Universal Declaration came after World War II and the Holocaust, and it was a response to the atrocities of this time period and international recognition that as an international community we could not let these things happen again, and that we needed codified codified sort of moral legal norms to make sure these things didn't happen again. Onto the climate change regime, there are lots of international institutions that legitimate the climate change regime. There's the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who produce reports on the science of climate change and the impacts and mitigation potential. It's also an example of multilateral collaboration. So it's intergovernmental. So there are scientists from lots of different governments around the world who contribute to this report and contribute to the language of this report, most interestingly. And because of this multilateral collaboration, this makes the reports more likely to be accepted and therefore more likely to continue this climate change regime. The domestic governance of the climate change regime includes national net zero targets, and also declarations of climate emergencies on national levels, but also on local levels. Also, the rhetoric of climate change is also very emotional. We talk about a climate emergency or a climate crisis. And finally, a triggering event for accepting climate change as a legitimate issue. I mean, that was an interesting one. It's a little bit more tricky because climate change is such a chronic long-term issue. It's difficult to pinpoint a specific event, but I would argue that there's been an election in Australia, and they've elected a very climate positive new prime minister and party, when previously they were pretty skeptical of climate change and into promoting the coal industry. And I would argue that the Australian wildfires from a few years ago was a kind of triggering event, because the old Prime Minister, his response to these Australian wildfires, which were in part caused by climate change, his response were very weak, sort of brushing it off, denying it was anything to do with climate change. And I think the Australian people got really fed up with this, and they've now elected a new party that's going to take climate change seriously. So I would argue that the Australian wildfires were a sort of triggering event for acceptance of a national climate change regime. So if we identify the common features of these regimes, they build consensus over time, and this is a big issue. Human rights didn't just appear one day. They were brewing ever since the Magna Carta, you could argue. They had event triggers, sort of transformative, kind of acutely shocking events that really pushed them into people's minds and made them suddenly care about these issues. They also have institutions with teeth. When I say that, I mean sometimes international courts and international law is it's generally soft law, so countries can just disobey the laws and there's not necessarily any they can't be put in prison, they can't be put in country prison. It's pretty difficult to make countries obey laws. So institutions with teeth, like the national courts and national rulings, actually make populations take this seriously. And finally, you have a cultural translation, right? So what do human rights mean to someone in the United Kingdom? What do they mean to someone in India, for example? You have national courts that translate this onto a local level. What does climate change mean for someone in the UK as opposed to just generally in the globe? So towards an international rights of nature regime, is this possible? What features are there of successful regimes, and how could a rights of nature regime emulate these features and be successful? So are there some institutions? Well, yes, there are a few institutions. There is the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature. They do rulings on sort of nature rights cases and environmental degradation cases. Their rulings lack legal teeth, but they do get the conversation going. And I think they have a very valuable contribution to this movement. There's also the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, which coordinates activists and actors from all across the globe. And also, there's recently been an ecocide, an official definition of ecocide by the Stop Ecocide Foundation, which is an international foundation. So yes, there are some institutions around which actors can gather, and institutions that can try and popularize norms and principles, but these institutions do lack legal teeth. So they will need a domestic translation on national and local levels. So we've seen this in the United States, and we've seen this in Ecuador. Bolivia also has nature rights in the constitution, and also in New Zealand. And New Zealand's actually an interesting example. They're an example of a Western legal system trying to translate sort of non-Western Maori principles into their legal system. The laws recognize the spiritual significance of the Te Rewa forest and the Wanganui River, which is different to other laws that don't recognise the spiritual significance of nature in New Zealand. So that is really interesting, and that will be an interesting development. How can Western legal systems integrate this very radical, very different sort of jurisprudence into their legal systems? The powerful rhetoric of rights of nature is also interesting. Claiming that nature has rights can be very not controversial, but it stokes interests and questions, and it gets the conversation going. Rights also imply duties and obligations that human beings have towards nature, and it also implies that nature has moral worth, right? It doesn't have instrumental value in that you know, a tree has worth because I can cut it down and make furniture. The tree has intrinsic worth from its very existence as a tree. It has moral worth. There's also building consensus over time. So this is a fairly quote unquote new regime on an international level and on a jurisprudence level, but it is linked to Indigenous rights and Indigenous culture, which are very ancient cultures. So you could argue that actually it's not a new idea, but in order to build an international regime, it'll just take time for these ideas to become more socially accepted. And finally, a triggering event for rights of nature. This is tricky. The same with climate change. Environmental problems tend to be chronic and long-term, so it's difficult to see a kind of acute event that changes people's perspectives and suddenly makes them care about it. But you could argue that the biodiversity crisis we're currently in could be a triggering event. We have an unprecedented extinction rate. We have 1 in 4 species at risk, and especially in the UK, we are one of the world's most nature depleted countries, right at the bottom of the league table. You could argue that maybe rights of nature is what we need. Maybe that will finally help us restore our biodiversity. So thank you very much for listening. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Jasmine. That was great. Yeah, as ever, please add your questions or your comments into the chat for Jasmine. We're kind of pretty much on time, but with a few minutes to spare, so we absolutely do have time for some questions or discussion. So yeah, please don't be shy. Please add any thoughts or comments or questions in there. I've got a bit of a question, Jasmine. When you discussed the role of triggering events, and I couldn't help but think of COVID as well, the most recent kind of ultimate triggering event across many kind of different platforms. So I wondered if you thought whether the COVID pandemic has had any bearing on people's thought around nature rights or kind of nature generally, if you think it has or it may in time represent a bit of a change in perspectives on nature.
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought of that, but I yes. I mean, for me personally, the pandemic was a big triggering event. It made me realise I was interested in climate change, and it made me want to study climate change. I think nature also, I really appreciated nature when I was in lockdown. My local park was suddenly this amazing thing that I could go to, and this break from my little stuffy house that I was living in. So I do wonder if COVID has changed people's perspectives. It's made people sort of take a second and think more deeply about what their values are, and the importance of nature as well. You could also, there were reports as well that because there was less pollution and less traffic on the roads, you could also hear birds finally during lockdown, when you couldn't before. So that's a really interesting question. I hope yes. I hope the answer is yes.
Do you think that added appreciation of nature, as you've described, I think you're right. I think lots of people did, things were quieter, less traffic, less pollution, or maybe more time to, get outside. And in the early lockdowns, for that allocated amount of exercise, we could stop and really appreciate, the fresh air, the greenery, the surroundings. But do you think that will translate into an interest, or an increased interest for people to the extent that they would consider kind of nature rights, or do you think there's still some work, some greater awareness that perhaps is needed to explain that concept of rights?
Sorry, my phone's just going off 1 second. There we go. Sorry, I had to run. I think it's difficult in our Western culture. We see nature for its instrumental value, right? We see nature is valuable because I can enjoy it on a walk, or because I can cut down that tree to make furniture, for example. Whereas we don't see nature for its intrinsic value, or necessarily even its spiritual significance, which indigenous cultures, for example, the Maori culture, do. They see nature as having a soul, as having spiritual significance, being part of their community. So I think it will take more than just lockdown and a pandemic to change our whole Western cultural idea of nature. It'll take a very long time. And it'll take ingenious people and ingenious lawyers making great arguments in courts to show that nature rights is a viable approach to biodiversity conservation.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. It's certainly something that struck me across your presentation and Alex's and Ibikan's, the different perspectives around justice and governance and rights and responsibilities, and your subject area is different, but those are common threads that draw them all together. And I think it really emphasises the importance of considering governance, whether it's soft governance or more stringent laws and codes that are required, whatever area of sustainability we're looking at, and ideally kind of finding those opportunities to integrate those together. So yeah, all of you, thank you for prompting some interesting thoughts on those. We do now have some comments on the chat, so I'll just take a look at those. So Ashley has commented, a very interesting debate, thank you. I can see implications in the science and technology field, development of materials, products, etc. If nature rights were implemented more, some kind of regulation could help develop this positively and hold more parties to account. So thank you for that, Ashley. And Shivani has said, hi Jasmine, great presentation. I'm also looking at this concept in my research. I wanted to pick your brain in regards to two things. One, there are a lot of rights, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people get their needs met. What does this mean under this concept? What does that mean under this concept?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You could argue that just because, you can declare that people have rights, that doesn't mean that their rights will be respected, right? So that's a difficult one. I think Earth jurisprudence specifically has been more reactive, as opposed to, in some places it's been sort of proactive, but in other places it's been reactive. So the Lake Erie example in the United States, that was because the local population around Lake Erie didn't have any other means to get justice for themselves. So they used nature rights as a way, and the personhood of Lake Erie as a way to sue these corporations and to stop them from polluting. So I think it's less this kind of, it's less the idea, it's less just, let me think about how I'm going to phrase this. The movement's less about just declaring nature has rights and cool, that's the end of it, we can pack up and go home. And it's more about this being a kind of new, ingenious sort of legal way of holding people to account.
Thanks, Jasmine. And Shivani goes on to say another thing she's looking at is in relation to India mostly, is that rights to nature exclude human rights, specifically minority rights. So how to make rights nature nuanced to be mindful? Question mark.
Yeah, that's a great question. You could argue a lot of approaches to conservation outside of nature rights, a lot of approaches to conservation can be very bad for local communities. For example, declaring an area as a protected area, fencing it off from everyone else and saying you're not allowed to fish there, you're not allowed to cut down trees. And I don't care if that's your culture, you're just not allowed to. Obviously, that has a lot of justice issues. That's really unfair for local populations. Who are doing all those things, but they're doing them sustainably and with long-term sustainability in mind. So I think it's important. Nature rights doesn't say that you can never cut down another tree or you can never kill another animal. That's not what nature rights says. Nature rights says that the integrity of ecosystems has to be preserved, and you can still fish and you can still mine and cut down trees as long as you protect the integrity of the ecosystem and you don't degrade it to the point that it, ceases to exist. So you can still have, I think you can still have minority rights, you can still protect local cultures and local ways of life and also protect nature. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive.